Good morning. Welcome back. Today, we are going to talk about breaking the rules, which I know we've touched on before in the context of some of the fairy tales that we've done. But here we're going to focus on that as the theme. Instead of looking specifically at one fairy tale, we're going to look at a variety of things. So, with breaking the rules, it's a disruption of the patterns that we've often inherited. And through that process, we're reclaiming power from from an external source, some kind of authority figure. So disrupting patterns is cycles of repeating situations are what we're in when we disrupt the pattern. There's a situation that you see over and over again. It keeps coming back, and the desire is, especially if it's not something that we really want to see in our lives, the idea is that we disrupt that. That's the pattern, and that's what we want to disrupt. So oftentimes those situations, especially if they're undesirable, can trigger specific emotions. And so that's what the cycle would be. The cycle would be, whenever I'm in this situation, this is the response. And initially what happens is it's very unconscious. It's often a situation where it can be overwhelming and the response is so instantaneous. And so there's like no consciousness between the moment of the incident and the moment of the response. It's just completely unconscious. But when you're doing inner work and you're like looking at your own behavior and saying, wow, look at that situation, that this is what happened and this was the response, and I couldn't do anything any differently. What often happens in those situations is that we say, they're the problem. They need to change. But ideally, what happens is if they have the power to disrupt what we feel, if they have the power to control what we feel by their behavior or by their action, or it can be a big they or a singular they, then we don't have our own power. They have it because their behavior is controlling us. So this idea of disrupting these patterns is with the interest of those things being able to take our power back so that they can have their own behavior. They can do what they want, and we remain in our power and able to handle the emotion that's coming up. So what happens is we want to try and create space. The idea then is that there are steps to creating space. Initially, like I said, it's often unconscious, but the more awareness we're able to bring to these situations, the more we're able to create space between the trigger and the response. Good morning, Michelle. Nice to see you. So we're creating space between the event and the response. So there are stages. Initially, it's completely unconscious. Then it becomes more conscious. It's often after the fact, and you see, oh, you know what? That situation happened again. I was triggered, and I had the same unconscious response. But that's bringing consciousness to it, even if it's after the fact. And so the more that you do that and you're able to see, the more you're able to become conscious in the situation that caused the trigger in the first place. So then as the trigger comes, what happens often next is you're in the situation and you have an opportunity to change the response, but it's actually more comfortable to not change the response. It's more comfortable to stay in the pattern. So there can be a period where you actually keep repeating it consciously because it's just more comfortable. And then in the next stage, what happens is that you're in the situation, you have an opportunity, you become conscious in the situation, you say, I can change my response here, and you do. And this is the way of actually repatterning your own brain, rewiring your brain to create a new behavior, to create a new response. And then what happens is once you've cleared it, and it becomes like, okay, this is them, this isn't about me, and I don't respond to it, then I've not only reclaimed my power, but typically that situation will go away because there's no longer a reason for it to be in your life The only reason usually it's there is to create the clearing of your own unconscious and give you your power back. So, one of the beauties of life is this kind of baked in way of freeing us from what we've inherited from the culture, from the family, and from our own life experiences. So, we can change our beliefs, we can change our actions, and we can change our response. So, that would be changing the response. Over time, it can change the belief, because in that type of a situation, there's the trigger, and you might say in that moment, okay, what am I believing in this situation? And see that what you're believing isn't always accurate. It's not always, because it's often something from the past. It can sometimes be an overlay onto a situation with an interpretation that's completely erroneous. You might walk away, be reflecting on the situation and saying, what did I believe in that moment? And it actually wasn't necessarily what was happening in the moment, or what was intended by, if it was specifically another person, that person in particular. So in terms of even politics, we can look at politics and say, whatever the other side is doing is the problem. But then even stepping back from that, we don't always know if our interpretation is correct. And we don't always know what the deeper implication is of what's happening, which can be very different from what appears to be happening on the surface. So when we refuse to conform, we're refusing to follow these old structures that are limiting us. So it's a way to free us from the limitations. And it's so fascinating to look at this, because it's really, in a way, it just infuses things. It infuses stories. It infuses religion. It really, there's this, especially for the feminine, there's this kind of theme that you just see throughout all different kinds of areas, which we're going to really break down here today. So the reasons to break the patterns is to reclaim that power and to reclaim our autonomy from the unconscious programs that are either, like I said, part of the culture, part of our family inheritance, or part of our own upbringing and what we've learned. So the example that I want to start with today is from, I'm not French and I can't speak French, Le Morte d'Arthur. So King Arthur. So this version was written by Thomas Malory in the 15th century. So one of my favorite stories out of this particular story, that's one of these stories within a story, is the story of Gawain and Lady Ragnell. So if you've heard of it, it's an awesome story. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. You can just look it up on Wikipedia and they give a synopsis. What happens is Arthur is out with some of the other knights and they're hunting. And he gets separated from the group, and he's in this enchanted forest, and he comes across Sir Gromer. And Sir Gromer is upset with Arthur because he says Arthur has given away some of his land to Sir Gawain. So, but because he's a knight, Sir Gromer, he can't attack Arthur because Arthur isn't in his, he doesn't have any weapons, he isn't in his armor. It wouldn't be, knightly, chivalrous, whatever the word they use, to kill him under these circumstances. So he says, I'll tell you what. He says, I'll give you 1 year, and in 1 year you have to agree to come back to this place exactly as you are right now, meaning without any weapons or anything. And I'm going to cut your head off unless you can answer this question. And the question is, what do women most want? So Arthur says, okay. So he goes back to Camelot. The knights are all gathered together. And Gawain notices that his uncle is unhappy. And he pesters him until finally Arthur tells him what happened. So Gawain says, well, we'll just go out into the kingdom and we'll ask people and we'll find the answer to the question. So they would ride out and collect answers and then come back and compare. And so day after day goes by and they're getting closer to the 1 year point, and they really don't feel like they've found an answer yet. So Gawain's like, we can't give up. We can't get disheartened. We'll have to go out again. We just have to go out again. So it's like the day before, 2 days before. And they go out, and Arthur comes across this old hag at a well. And he says, I have a question for you. She says, well, what is that? He said, what is it that women most want? She says, I can tell you, but in order to get the answer, a fair knight has to agree to marry me. So Arthur goes back to Camelot. Again, Gawain's like, what happened? Arthur doesn't want to tell him because he knows Gawain is going to volunteer. And he's like, this woman is hideous. She is just unbelievable. You can't even look at her. She's so awful. And Gawain says, I don't care. I'm going to do it to save your life. So Arthur goes back the next day and he says, okay. He says, Gawain has agreed to marry you. She says, the thing that women most want in life is sovereignty. So the next day, Arthur meets Grommer. And Grommer says, okay, so what is the answer to the question? And Arthur says, sovereignty. And Grommer is angry. You ran into my sister. She's the only one who knows the answer to that question. Right. So he goes back to, Gawain comes, gets Lady Ragnall, and they start to come back to Camelot. And everybody knows there's a big wedding coming and that Gawain is getting married. And they're lining the streets and they're all celebrating and they see him coming in the distance and the din goes up in the crowd and yay, here comes Gawain. He saved Arthur's life. They're all excited. But as they get closer and they see Lady Ragnall, this silence just falls across the entire crowd. And they get silent and they just watch as she rides by. And they are just beside themselves. This wonderful knight, this gallant knight, is marrying this hideous, hideous hag. She goes in. They have the wedding the next day. And they're eating their Christmas dinner, their wedding dinner, Christmas wedding. Oh, it's all the same. So they're eating the wedding dinner and she is slobbering and food is falling out of her mouth. And it's just absolutely disgusting. People have to look away because it's just too much to bear to look at. So that night, Gawain faces the wedding night. And at first he hesitates because he just doesn't know how to make himself like embrace this, right? And so eventually he decides, you know what? I need to embrace this. This is what I agreed to. And when he makes that decision, he looks at her and she's the most beautiful. She's turned into the most beautiful woman he has ever seen in his life. And she says, because you're a fair knight and you have agreed to marry me, you have freed me. You have freed me from the curse. But you have only freed me from half the curse, because I can be beautiful by day when everyone else sees me, or beautiful by night when only you see me and it's only you and I together. What's your choice? His heart swells with love. And he says, lady, he says, it's not my choice, it's yours. And she says, in what you have just said, you have freed me completely from the curse, and now I can be beautiful by day and by night. So literally, it looks like he has her power. But again, because you've been following these fairy tales, we look at it as a part of her. So this would be his feminine. And what he's done is he's opened his heart and he's seen the beauty in the feminine. And through seeing the beauty in the feminine, opening his heart, the answer wasn't in his head. The answer was in his heart. And through that, he was able to, her own masculine was able to value and defer to the wisdom and knowledge of the feminine as the way to break the patterns and reclaim power. Right. Woohoo! Isn't that great story. I love it. So I highly recommend it. All the details would be in a reading. So great story. Love it about sovereignty. And to think 15th century is what this story is from. So very cool. So breaking the rules, not following outer convention or inner conditioning. That's essentially what was happening here, right? This is a pattern, and you can see even in the larger picture of the story. If you look at Excalibur, and I haven't read Lamort D'Arthur, the whole thing, so I don't know how it differs from Excalibur. But in Excalibur, what happens is there comes this critical moment where there's this kind of tension building between Guinevere and Lancelot. And people are picking up on this. People are noticing, and they're starting to whisper and talk about an affair happening between them. And at one point, they're at one of their feasts, and one of the knights challenges and is like, you know what, this is too much. Nobody's actually talking out loud about the fact that there's this, romance going on between Lancelot and Guinevere. So what needed to happen in that moment was Arthur would accept the challenge, and they would joust and to the death and if he won, then that would mean that she was innocent, and if he lost, that would mean that she was guilty. So she looks to him and she says, you're my champion. You're going to have to, fight for me. And he says, I can't. He says, I'm the king. I can't do that. And she says, you're king over husband? And so I know a lot of people wouldn't necessarily see it this way, but that was the critical moment. The moment wasn't when she was with Lancelot and they had sex. The moment was there. The moment was there where he was not in alignment with his heart. Lancelot chose to follow his heart over his duty. And that's what Gawain did to a certain degree, was saying, okay, my heart comes first. It's not my head. And that was a departure. That story within a story is a departure from the overall framework. So what we see here is two different things happening. On the one hand, you have the story of the Gawain's, regardless of what it appears like on the surface, his dedication to this commitment to her, that he was not going to just do it in a superficial way. He really was going to commit to this. That was very different than the overall. In Excalibur, what happens is they end up in the wasteland. They end up in the wasteland because he wasn't committed. And the only way to restore the wasteland was to get the Grail and to drink from the Grail cup, which was the feminine. So he had to reestablish his relationship with the feminine. Right, heart over head, right, the feminine way. So this shows you that this story was the kind of like the kernel or the seed for what was the appropriate behavior in the larger context of the bigger story. So breaking the rules we see in a variety of stories. So we have to question, why is this important? And what's really interesting is, and I'm not somebody who's really well versed on a lot of stories about males, but you really don't see them. If you think about it, we have so many fairy tales around the feminine. Jack and the Beanstalk, I mean, I'm not sure that's in the Grimm's fairy tales or not, but you see really the bulk of the stories seem to me anyway to be around the feminine. And breaking the rules happens in a lot of stories. I mean, we've talked about this a lot. So we have this in religion with Eve, right? Don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And I've talked about this several times before, that she's considered the one who, was the cause of the fall. The snake comes in. The snake, according to Gnostics, is the teacher. So the teacher comes to teach something. That was the point of it. And as I've said before, they eat the fruit and they open their eyes to good and evil, which was really that they were already living in duality. So they just became aware of the fact that they've gone from the unconscious now to conscious, as I talked about in the beginning, and now they see that in fact they're in duality. So you can't be separate from God. I mean, this idea of religion that there was a fall and then we were somehow separated from God isn't true, because it's just impossible. So the idea is that the separation was just a thought. It's just a thought that there was separation, that actually can't happen. And there was this part of that story is that we weren't supposed to eat from the tree of life, which I talked about last week. But that tree of life also represents immortality, which is also true. Not on a human level at this point, but on a soul level, we already are. So there really never was a fall. And this idea that it was her fault and that she's to blame for something that really never even happened. So the only thing that we're looking at is really getting our consciousness back to a unitary perspective, as I've talked about, which means stepping out of duality, which is just a conditioned way of perceiving what the world is that we live in and ourselves. So Eve is one story, right? She's the feminine who broke the rules. She defied God. I mean, look at that. Like this idea that she's somehow weak and whatever, she's the one that stood up. So Jesus said the kingdom is at hand. It's here. So it has nothing to do with what happened then. Lot's wife is another story. Disobeys God, dares to look. She turns. So if these stories are trying to condition us, to tell us, don't do this, because it's going to be a bad outcome. It's not going to be good. If you dare to defy God and then you dare to look, then we're going to turn you into a pillar of salt. But as I've talked about before, a pillar of salt means she was enlightened. So just accepting that, right? If you dare to look and then you actually see the truth, just like Eve eating the apple, it's daring to see the truth of what's there. And when you look, you can see. I've talked before, if you watch something, if you sit with something for long enough, sometimes that veil will part and you will see the deeper truth. So when you're told, don't look, don't do this, don't do that, this authority figure is trying to keep these blinders on and keep you from perceiving what's really true about these situations. So there's Lilith, which I might have also mentioned before, who is the first wife of Adam, refuses to be subservient, refuses to be underneath him. And as far as I'm concerned, that's another reason why they had to eat the apple, was because Eve didn't know about Lilith. Eve didn't know that Eve was subservient. She was the helper to Adam, and Lilith refused, and she was the first wife. So you can see how, if you're the first wife, and then what did they do? She was made into a demon, which isn't true. She flew away to the desert and said, I'd rather be alone than be subservient to you. Hey, so you can take that story with a grain of salt. I know a lot of people have a hard time with that one, but setting that aside, we have Cinderella, who stepmother says, don't go to the ball, and she ignores her, and she goes anyway. And she hides it, and they don't find out who she really is until the prince comes the third time and the shoe gets on her foot. So she defies it. So who's considered the goddess? A Lilith? It's funny. I would be like, I'd like to see your face. Yes, no. Angelina was another one we talked about. And she also refused to marry the mole when, yes, Lilith, I'm aware of that she's often perceived as this really empowered goddess. I mean, someone who really was, in Greek mythology and Roman mythology, sometimes it can get a little muddy where, maybe Zeus or can, have a little bit more power over the goddesses. But with Lilith, it's this feeling that she's really in it, kind of like a Kali figure. Like, you're not getting over on her. Nobody is. So Angelina, the mouse, if you remember, said you have to marry the mole or I'm going to bite you. She defied her husband. Lilith did, in terms of Adam. Is that what you're saying? Okay, so the mouse said, don't not to that she had to marry the mole when Angelina said she didn't want to, and so she said she would bite her if she didn't, and so Angelina ends up coming to terms with it, and she left, right? So Psyche, which we've also talked about, dares to look in the box of beauty. She was told not to. Do not look in this box of beauty. And she doesn't listen. She breaks the rule. She looks inside and she falls into what they call a death-like sleep. And so in this death-like sleep, again, often interpreted by the interpretation I read by a male, said, you know, he didn't say she broke the rule. He said she regressed. That was the word he used. He said it's a regression. She went backwards. And because she went backwards, then she was saved by Amor, her husband. But that's not how I see it. A death-like sleep means she is dying to the part of her that was the human part of her. Not in the sense of denying the human aspect, but of awakening to the immortal aspect of herself. Because at that point, when he wipes the sleep from her eyes, she's able to look at him. And you know, in most mythology, humans can't look on a god and live. So, or at least continue to be able to see. They're blinded or whatever. So in that moment, she wakes up and she can see him. And that means that finally she is freed and she knows who she is. And then they get married and she drinks the nectar of immortality and becomes immortal. So it's just telling you like that this had already happened. So Psyche breaks the rules. Rapunzel breaks the rules. She lets the prince in and she conspires with him to escape from the tower. Sleeping Beauty. In Sleeping Beauty, we have the 13th fairy who defies the king. Everybody's blessing his daughter. And what does she do? She doesn't bless her. She curses her. So we see over and over again, the feminine is the one who is standing up to authority and who is challenging it. So we can look at this literally, but we can also look at it on an inner sense. What is the inner authority? That conditioned inner authority that we need to stand up to and make sure that we have the power and not the conditioning that we've inherited. So breaking the rules in the story is a critical moment. It happens over and over again at these very critical times in the stories where she ignores the authority figure. She speaks, she expresses, she does what she wants, she's seen and heard, she's loud, she's free, she's loving. Like it's defying like all these ways of the inherited, like the environment that she's living in, what the way that's perceived and that's accepted as what's the norm here. She's the one that's defying and stepping out and going into a new pattern or a new way of being in the old pattern, we could say. So daring to look is a theme, one of the themes that happens over and over again. Psyche, Lot's wife, in the fairy tale of Bluebeard, which has a variety of titles to it, and in the Tennyson poem, The Lady of Shalott. This is another one of my favorite stories related to the Arthur Camelot kind of, I don't know what you would call it, theme. And so what does it mean to dare to look? Because this happens over and over again. Don't look back, don't look inside, don't look here, don't look there, don't do this. Dare to look usually is back and inside. So what does that mean? In a story, like how are they going to portray looking inside ourselves? Would be look inside the box, look behind you, right? Behind you, in terms of, we talked about last week with the eclipse, is behind you is where that chakra is in the back of the head, like I said, that opened up for me in that dream, and there was the eclipse back there. And the poems that I write over and over again say, go back to what you were before you were born. And if you remember, there was the connection to birth in that chakra. So there's this idea that looking back, right? Looking back to what you were before you were born. What was that like before you got the story, before that came into being? Right. Go deep within yourself. Exactly. To find the truth. And the more that you're able to do this, and I think this is what happened, in my own personal opinion, to the times of the witches. They were empowered. They knew the answers were inside. So when you have that authority, you can't be controlled. You can't, like, someone can tell you things all day long. Like I have mentioned before, that I had an awakening about everything being love, and nobody can tell me that's not true. Nobody could ever convince me that, because I know it's true. And it's not something I have to convince other people about. But once you have that inner truth, there's nothing anybody can do to change it. So I think that in a way they felt threatened by that. And that these stories, and taking them in a literal sense, were kind of the way of seeing that it was keeping everybody in line. But if you just, again, looked deeper and peeled back that surface, superficial, literal, logical, rational way of looking at these, you can see they had these patterns in them and ways to break the patterns and free yourself and become empowered. So why is it so important? Why are we being told over and over again not to do this? We're being given rules that if you do this, you're going to be, turned into a pillar of salt, and that's not a good thing. You're going to be frozen forever. What's being hidden? That's what we have to ask here. What is being hidden? And in my opinion, truth, power, and freedom. That sovereignty is hidden. And that's what we have to uncover in ourselves in order to be free, truly free in the world. One more story, Lady of Shalott. So this is the Tennyson poem. Again, I highly recommend it. I recommend reading it in it more Old English, because it's just so lyrical, and it's just fun to read if you haven't already read it, or listening to Lorena McKennitt does an amazing version of this poem. So in this poem, the Lady of Shalott is in a small castle in an island in a river that goes up to Camelot. And she's been cursed. And what she can't do is look direct. She can't look directly at what's happening in the world. But she has to look in a mirror. And she watches things go by in the mirror. And then what she does, because she can see out the window through the mirror. And then what she does is she weaves a tapestry based on what she sees in the mirror. But she's not allowed to turn directly. So the poem goes on, and the poem talks about what she's seeing through the window. And then it says, or when the moon was overhead, came two young lovers lately wed. I'm half sick of shadows, said the Lady of Shalott. And that's kind of the turning point. So that's where I'm taking you. But there's more to the poem than this. A bough shot from her bower eaves, he rode between the barley sheaves. The sun came dazzling through the leaves and flamed upon the brazen greaves of bold Sir Lancelot. A red cross knight forever kneeled to a lady in his shield that sparkled on the yellow field beside remote Shalott. The gemmy bridle glittered free like some branch of stars we see. Hung in the golden galaxy, the bridal bells rang merrily as he rode down from Camelot. And from his blazoned baldric slung, a mighty silver bugle hung, and as he rode his armor rung beside remote Shalott. All in the blue unclouded weather, thick jeweled shone the saddle leather. The helmet and the helmet feather burned like one burning flame together as he rode down from Camelot. As often through the purple night, below the starry clusters bright, some bearded meteor trailing light moves over green Shalott. His broad clear brow in sunlight glowed, on burnished hooves his war horse trode. From underneath his helmet flowed his coal-black curls as he rode from Camelot. From the bank and from the river he flashed into the crystal mirror. Tiralira, tiralira, sang Sir Lancelot. She left the web, she left the loom. She made 3 paces through the room. She saw the water lily bloom. She saw the helmet and the plume. She looked down to Camelot. Out flew the web and floated wide. The mirror cracked from side to side. The curse has come upon me, cried the Lady of Shalott. So this was the moment when she broke the pattern. She goes out of the castle. There's a boat tied to the side of the river. She unties it. She carves her name, the Lady of Shalott, in the prow of the boat, and she lays down. And as the boat floats down the river towards Camelot, she chants. She chants loud, she chances low, and she sings until the life basically ebbs from her body and she dies. And then she comes down and she floats past Camelot. They cross themselves out of fear. They see who it is. And Lancelot is standing there and says that she's very fair. And so once again, we would look at this and say, I read this to somebody and they were like, oh, that's so sad. I was like, yeah, but that's literal. So if you don't look at it literally, what we see is she broke the pattern. So what actually died was the part of her that had agreed to this condition, had agreed to not look, had believed that there was some outer authority that could curse her, some outer authority that could tell her, like, okay, this is what you have to do. This is how you have to live. And so what she did was she broke that pattern. She took the power back, and then she was able to leave. And what actually died was that part of her that was conditioned, and she just freed herself. As we also would like to do. So hopefully that you enjoyed that poem. It is just one of my favorites. Symbolically, of course, in a literal sense, if you take it, it might not seem like such a happy little story, but it really is when you look at it deeper, more deeply than the superficial, whether we're talking about the Garden of Eden or the Lady of Shalott or Lady Ragnar. What you see is the deeper essence of these stories is about freeing the feminine. So freeing the feminine. Lorena McKenna does an amazing version. She's just, and her voice is just so hauntingly beautiful. She does such a great job of it. It's right on YouTube, so you can listen to it on there. But thank you for joining me, Michelle. It's nice to see you. And let's break the rules. Let's dare to look. Let's reclaim power and sovereignty, and we already are. That's really the key, is that we already are powerful and sovereign. It's just the conditioning that makes us believe in certain situations that we aren't. So, thank you. Have a great day. And I'll see you next Saturday, hopefully. Take care.